You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hello, welcome to News Talks, the Times Higher Education podcast in which we discuss some of the biggest stories in global higher ed. I'm Miranda Prynne, and joining me today is our THE news editor, Tom Williams. Tom, thank you for extracting yourself from the relentless spin of the news cycle to talk today.
No problem at all. Glad to be here.
Am I right in thinking you spent some years reporting for radio, so you should be a dab hand at podcasting?
That's put me on the spot now. Yes, I was the premier news bulletin reader at BBC Radio Oxford for a short period. I wouldn't check that claim to be the best. It might not stand up.
I'm sure you're being falsely modest. Anyway, we are not here to discuss your career history. Fascinating, though I'm sure that would be. This week, we are turning our attention to international branch campuses. These are the headline grabbers of transnational education, ambitious international projects involving big vision, big investment, big risks, sometimes big failures, but if it all works out, potentially big returns. So there's been a flurry of new branch campus announcements in the last 12 months, with India becoming a particular focal point for many of these projects. Several UK and Australian institutions have launched or are on the cusp of launching branch campuses in India. Notably, the University of Southampton and the University of New South Wales, UNSW, have both already started teaching in Delhi and Bangalore, respectively, with many others hoping to follow suit in coming months. But this surge of enthusiasm for branch campus projects has sparked warnings from international education experts who rightly point to the huge challenges associated with trying to create a new higher education institution in unfamiliar territory. And it was thought for a while that these challenges had led to a cooling of enthusiasm for branch campuses after a sort of gold rush in the early 2000s. So, Tom, what do you think has spurred this renewed interest in branch campuses in recent years?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, if you look back on our coverage just before the pandemic, all the stories we were writing were about withering branch campuses and any such metaphor that you could throw at it, really. That it seemed to be there had been mass enthusiasm for the branch campus, basically everyone trying to replicate what some institutions, the University of Nottingham is the one that always sticks in the mind, given its success in Malaysia and China, those campuses going on well over 2 decades old now and very firmly established. On the back of that, there seemed to be a big rush in the mid-2010s. There was a lot more money around the sector then, lots of people up for trying new things. That sort of died a bit of a death. There were some very high profile closures. Yeah, lots of institutions got their hands burnt in trying to do something in foreign countries. But as you say, now we are looking at a renewed push, and there's obviously lots of reasons behind that. And lots of places don't go into these initiatives blind. There would be lots of reasons why people wanted to set up branch campuses. I think there's the wider picture, and then there's specific factors. You mentioned India. I think a large factor behind that push in India is the work the Indian government has been doing to relax regulation that has allowed institutions to come in. Previously, it was seen, as nigh on impossible, really, to launch in India, even though India would probably be, after China, one of the most obvious places to set up a branch campus. But it just didn't have the right regulatory environment, and the Indian government recognised that, addressed that a couple of years ago, and we're now seeing the fruits of that work. But you can't get away from the wider context. Clearly, universities in the UK, to a certain extent Australia as well, suffering financially. There has been a big move to restrict incoming international students in various ways, which everyone will be aware of. And the flip side of that is institutions saying, well, we can't bring international students to our shores, so we're going to go to where they are and we're going to try to teach them there. And clearly part of the motivation for doing that is to set up a new revenue stream, try to complement the income that is coming in from the home campus, but also to satisfy the global demand for higher education, which in countries like India is ever expanding. And it's a fact that countries like India are struggling to meet that demand. So they do need some outside support. But that also does raise questions about the optics of universities from abroad going into countries and how much they understand that environment and what students in the country need.
Yeah, so it really, in the broad terms, comes down to two key drivers, and one is the fall in domestic international students and the associated effect on revenue, although revenue is being challenged via other means as well, but also a sort of rising appetite for foreign universities in very fast-growing countries or countries with fast-growing populations like India. So are we seeing that same trend replicated in other nations around the world? I mean, are there other places where the governments are really actively encouraging foreign universities to come?
Yeah, I do think there's a bit of a sense that there's clearly been a rush to India, and there's a feeling perhaps that India is already possibly saturated or getting to the point of saturation, that each country can only support so many branch campuses. That's obvious. So there are universities looking around to see where the next spot is that might serve a similar purpose. A slightly unusual one is Greece, which is it's a similar story to India in the fact that it's to do with regulation and making it easier for universities to launch there. It's perhaps not in the same mass higher education space as India, clearly a European nation. It's a very different operating environment, but we have seen a number of universities setting up in Greece in recent years. There are any number of other countries, Thailand, Vietnam, and obviously more established bases that are still being looked at for openings, China being the obvious one, Malaysia, places where there have been branch campuses for a very long time.
Sticking with India as the focal point of current branch campus activity, I mentioned a couple of the institutions opening there already, but can you quickly take us through who has opened or is planning to open, as there has been quite a deluge?
Yeah, I'll do my best. Yeah, as you say, it's quite a ever-changing list. So the University of Southampton were the first to open in India, in Delhi. They did that last year, and it was a very quick turnaround time from when that was first made public that they intended to set up a base in India to it actually being open and accepting students. I think from memory it was about a year, possibly less. So yeah, it's evidence of how these things are happening in very short time frames. There are a lot of other universities a little way behind. Our most recent list includes Lancaster, Surrey, York, Aberdeen, Bristol, Liverpool, Queen's University, Belfast, and Coventry. So there may well be a couple of extras have been added to that more recently, and there will be conversations going on that are not public at the moment. So clearly a huge number of universities. I don't think we've seen anything quite like this in terms of branch campus openings in such a short space of time.
Yeah, and what do we know about the branch campuses that have recently opened or about to in India in terms of how they're operating and what their relationship is to the home institutions?
Yeah, so it's interesting in that the historic view of a branch campus, possibly again fueled by what Nottingham has done. If you look at Nottingham's big branch campuses in places like Malaysia, they are large campuses actually built to look like Nottingham's campus in the East Midlands. They've got a replica Trent building, and they have a boating lake like Nottingham campus does in the UK, and they are catering for thousands of students. What is happening in India, at least at the outset, is much smaller scale. So Southampton, as I said, has been going 8 months now, has got about 120 students. It is aiming to hit 5,000 eventually, but you think that is quite a small number to get going with. And that the size of the campus is obviously reflective of that, and the number of programs that are available is also reflective. So it's a bit like the London campuses you see that many institutions now operate, in that they tend to share office space. They're not a full campus. They're most of the time slightly constrained into a building or a floor of a building, and they're operating in these big places with many other institutions nearby. So Gift City is the most obvious example of that, but there are other places that are being set up to rival Gift City, and essentially what's going on there is that the universities have been given incentives to operate in those places, whether that's tax incentives or what have you. So they are very small in scale. They are teaching only a small number of programs, only a small number of students. All have ambitions to grow much beyond that, and the test of that will be over the next few years. You talk to university leaders, they're all talking about 10-year plans, 20-year plans. They all say they're in it for the long haul. They're keen to emphasise that it's not a knee-jerk reaction to needing to find a new source of income. It's a long-term commitment. But it's safe to say that branch campuses have traditionally been more far removed from a home campus. Again, university leaders will emphasise that the standard of education, the quality that students are receiving is on a par with what they would expect should they come to the UK. In practice, it's quite hard to implement that. You think you're operating in a very different environment, different rules, regulations. Staffing is clearly going to be a key factor. Are you taking your staff over from the UK to teach at your branch campus? Are you recruiting locally, or a mixture of both? Seems to be how many institutions are doing it. So yeah, it's going to have a different feel. It's going to have a different culture. I think that's inevitable, but you clearly then have to put the processes in place to ensure that the quality is there. And there have been examples in the past where the quality of education being offered at a branch campus has been found to be lacking.
So it sounds like these branch campuses, unlike some of the previous models, which very much sought to replicate the full campus experience, these sound much more specialised institutions at this stage, serving a much smaller number of students. And just briefly on Gift City, for anyone who's less aware of what that is, am I right in thinking that's a kind of purpose-built new city in Gujarat, as you say, where the government is incentivising universities to move there? But I believe they do have to provide courses within certain subject areas as part of that deal. So they are kind of restricted in terms of what they can offer.
Yeah, so Gift City is this slightly odd place. It's somewhat in the middle of nowhere. It's a special economic zone in Gujarat where several universities have opened. And as I said, you get the incentives there. Lots of your profits are tax-free. But yeah, as you say, it does come with the downside that you're expected to offer postgraduate courses linked to things like finance, management, and certain science and mathematics subjects, because that's what's been designated as what the skills needs are for that area. So yeah, clearly institutions that are opening are operating with these constraints.
I mean, the key thing I take away from this is just that it is a very different model, that these campuses are not about trying to replicate the full campus experience in the UK. But given the relatively small student numbers and the monumental amount of work and investment required to get these institutions up and running, what's in it for the founding universities, most of whom are fairly cash-strapped already? I mean, what's their long-term game plan here?
Yeah, so I think there clearly is one eye on being able to generate an income. That there is an extraordinary unmet need for higher education in some of these countries where people are going in. There is also the global mission that most universities see themselves as having, that a lot of university leaders you speak to will talk about two-way transfer, so the ability to take some of their UK-based students to a branch campus on the other side of the world, and equally bring some of their students who are based in places like India over to the UK for short, limited exchanges, and facilitate that knowledge sharing that will entail. It's also worth saying that a lot of the institutions that are opening are operating with local partners. So much of the risk has been taken out. Whereas, again, harking back to the Nottingham example, going over to build a whole new campus with several buildings and facilities would have been a very expensive undertaking. These ones are able to get off the ground much easier and with much less initial investment. And if you are operating in places like Gift City, then the facilities are mostly there for you already, or at least the cornerstone of what you might need. So it's a less risky endeavour than it may have been in the past.
You've talked about the fact there's a handful of countries that have altered their regulatory frameworks to welcome branch campuses in the last couple of years. What are these nations seeking to get out of it? What's their motivation?
It harks back to the UK universities' reputation around the world, still very well regarded, still seen as some of the places that you want to be working with. It's a badge of quality to have leading UK institutions working and setting up in your country. It shows global ambition. It shows a desire to provide the best education to your students. One of the things we possibly haven't touched on is one of the criticisms of that is that a lot of these places will inevitably be charging high fees. Some will be offering a small number of scholarships, but a lot of the general population in countries like India will not be able to access education at these places. It's pretty clear that that will be the case because of the expense involved. So there is a access question as well for the universities that are operating. How are they going to ensure that they are serving people, not just the elite of these countries?
Yeah, and of course, one of the key criticisms, aside from the cost factor, is that there's a lack of oversight and quality control on branch campuses. Is it felt within the sector that that's a well-founded criticism, or simply focused on a very small number of bad actors?
I think with transnational education in general, and particularly in branch campuses, there has been concerns about the quality, also the influence of a country's politics where you're operating. Again, China being the obvious example. How much are you expected to teach a more Chinese way of doing university education with all that might entail? And how much are you able to hang on to the more UK values that inform our higher education system? It's something that a lot of the universities that are operated in that country have to grapple with. Clearly, also now we're seeing a bit of pushback from domestic governments, most notably the one run by Donald Trump in America, about those more of Chinese partnerships. So you are really at the whims of geopolitical changes when operating these things, and you're one step removed perhaps, and a lot of places will have very strict oversight of their branch campuses, but it's easy to see how you can get into a situation where you are not able to keep a watching eye over everything that's happening in the same way you would be if it was your home campus. So there has been issues emerge where quality concerns have raised their head.
Yeah, there have been a lot of casualties among branch campus endeavours over the last quarter century, some more embarrassing and costly than others. I mean, to give one example, I think the University of Central Lancashire was actually rebuked by the then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in 2013 when it established an unauthorised branch campus in the buffer zone between Greek and Turkish Cyprus. But that is a one-off. What is the most common reason these projects fail?
I think it's down to the economics of it, really. There are many reasons why you'd want to set up a branch campus, but if you can't sustain the scale of the operations with the number of students paying tuition fees, then yes, it's not going to work. And that's clearly why a lot of people have found that they are not able to sustain branch campuses long term.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned geopolitics. Obviously, the recent conflict in the Middle East has caused massive disruption to the functioning of many international campuses across that region in places like Qatar, Abu Dhabi, UAE, United Arab Emirates, which have always hitherto been considered very low risk, stable locations. Do you think this will put the frighteners up some institutions considering branch campuses and create a bit more reticence?
Yeah, well, you've got this extraordinary situation that emerged over the weekend of Iran basically threatening the US universities that are operating in places like Qatar and United Arab Emirates straight out. I mean, we've seen since the hostilities that started earlier in the year, those campuses have been in the line of fire, as it were, but purely because of their proximity to some US bases that have come under attack. That announcement by the Iranian forces over the weekend seems to be a major escalation on that, saying that they view the university campuses as legitimate targets. And that was brought about by the fact that several Iranian universities were hit by shelling going in the opposite direction. So universities really being drawn into that conflict in the last couple of days, much more closely than they have done previously. But still, for the last couple of months, ever since the fighting started, you have clearly got the situation where countries that were seen as very stable, as you say, are now very unstable. You've got the situation where people are not able to fly in and out, which a branch campus relies heavily on, particularly if you are flying some of your staff back and forth. So that disruption to travel is very practical disruption to education. But then you've also clearly got the fact that bombs are falling fairly near to some of these campuses, and the universities have to take precautions to mitigate against that. And we've seen a lot of those campuses go online. But then the question that emerged during COVID, what's the point in paying for an in-person experience at a branch campus in a part of the world that you want to experience when a lot of that education is happening online? So clearly, the longer the fighting goes on in the Middle East, the more these questions are going to raise their heads. And you would expect places that have committed to some of those countries would continue with their plans. But I think if you were in the early days of thinking about setting up a branch campus in that part of the world, you would at the very least be putting those plans on hold to see how this situation develops, if not reassessing to think where else you could go that might offer a bit more stability.
Although it is indicative in a way of the fact that global geopolitics as a whole just feels very uncertain. So wherever you go, I guess there are kind of unknown unknowns, and perhaps this really puts that into sharp relief. Finally, the UK government's international education strategy finally came out in January, which set an ambitious target to increase education exports to 40 billion by 2030. So that's a 7 billion increase in the next 4 years. But it doesn't offer a great deal in the way of tangible support to universities to help them achieve this. So I just wondered, from your conversations, I mean, what's the general feeling in the sector about the government's stance on this? Are they seen as a help or a hindrance?
Yeah, it's interesting. That was the key thing, I think, that came out of the international education strategy, is that ministers felt that the previous one, as many will be aware, set a target for international students coming to the UK of 600,000 people. That was achieved very quickly, several years early, and was a product of the time when international students were encouraged, and expansion in that area was generally thought to be a good thing. We're obviously operating in a different environment now, and there was a feeling that you couldn't put a similar target into the strategy this time round. So we've ended up with this slight fudge of putting an economic value on it without putting a number on in terms of incoming students. And that number is intended to be a mixture of incoming students, but also this transnational education, which the government does seem very keen on. We've seen people like Keir Starmer go over to places like India with vice chancellors to encourage setting up of branch campuses. And that international education strategy heavily referenced the idea that you could take UK education abroad, because it is a way of expanding what universities do without those difficult questions that we've seen about migration and international students adding to numbers coming to the country. At the same time, as you say, there wasn't really much guidance in the strategy beyond the target itself. And since we've seen developments such as in the Department of Trade, quite a few of the staff who were working on that strategy now appear to have been moved into different roles or lost to cuts in the wider civil service. The Department of Trade would have been the body that had done a lot of that heavy lifting for setting up campuses abroad. The British Council, another body that would have traditionally been at the forefront of helping institutions set up abroad, has also had its own issues with cuts and funding. So, yeah, it's very easy to say these things and to say you want more transnational education exports. The environment that people are operating in is very difficult.
Yes. Well, it remains to be seen how many of these institutions will make a long-term success out of their proposed branch campuses. But what is fairly clear is that if universities are hoping to make a quick buck out of these projects to shore up troubled domestic finances, they are likely to be sorely disappointed. Branch campuses are a long-term investment, and a long-term view is definitely needed to develop and sustain these institutions. So we wish all those embarking on such ventures well and hope that they're strapped in for an eventful ride. Tom, thanks so much for talking to me today. I will let you get back to the news desk where no doubt the copy has been piling up in your absence.
No problem at all. Thanks so much.
And that's it for this week, folks. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please do like and subscribe, and we will be back with you in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.